This is the Kratom Science Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for KratomScience.com, your source for all things Kratom.
Today we have Clinical Associate Professor, University of Florida, PhD in Pharmaceutical Sciences, Masters in Forensic Toxicology, and Kratom expert, Dr. Oliver Grundmann.
So it's an interesting way how I got involved with Kratom. In 2015, one of my graduate students, one of my master's students who works in the forensic field with a forensic toxicology lab down in South Florida, submitted a paper as part of one of the courses we were taking, or he was taking with me. And he mentioned Kratom back then in his paper because it was involved in a fatal car accident of a relatively young person. And that's how it first actually appeared to me. That's how I first heard about Kratom. And from there, it just developed into kind of an interest of mine. We wrote the first review that was published in the International Journal of Legal Medicine together with another student who also was interested in Kratom. And then from there, I became interested from the perspective of who is actually taking Kratom in the United States, because we didn't really know and understand well who is the consumer, who is using Kratom for what reasons. And that led me to come up with a survey that garnered a lot of interest and yielded a lot of good results.
So what did you learn from that survey about who uses Kratom and why they use it?
Yeah, so there are certain limitations to anonymous self-reporting of health and in general drug use or substance use. If we open up a little bit more about ourselves, there tends to be either a slightly biased reporting, but nonetheless, I think that the data overall represented quite well the kind of current snapshot of users. And we kind of we categorized intentionally 4 uses of Kratom. One was for those who used Kratom for an illicit drug use, for self-treatment of illicit drug use in regards to preventing withdrawal symptoms or the treatment of withdrawal symptoms related to illicit drug use. If that's an opioid, if that's a stimulant, if that's anything else, a benzodiazepine, a barbiturate or like. Then we had the second category, if somebody was using a prescription drug and was misusing or abusing it. We looked at that if somebody had withdrawal symptoms or was trying to basically substitute Kratom for that prescription drug. Then we had a third category if somebody self-treated acute or chronic pain and used Kratom to do so. Or if somebody, that was the last category, was using Kratom for a mental or emotional condition, such as depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorders, or even something like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. So those were the 4 broad categories which we were inquiring about.
Okay, and I have a quote from, this is from the survey analysis. It said, those taking Kratom for an illicit drug dependency reported the best overall health, with 74.9% reporting good or very good health. Does this suggest kratom might be like a harm reduction tool?
So this has been proposed not only by our findings, but also by other smaller surveys or even just case reports. So Kirsten Smith, who has done that as part of her doctoral studies, and now also where she's working for NIDA in her role as a postdoctoral fellow with NIDA, has done some investigations. So it's interesting to see how people do not prefer to take kratom as an agent to get high, basically to say, I don't have currently access to heroin, or I have access to hydrocodone or another drug that one used to get high on, but rather to use it as a mitigation tool, as you said, to harm reduction tool, as a tool to as a way to get off of a drug or to prevent withdrawal symptoms. So similar to what we use in harm reduction therapy or in long-term treatment of opioid substance use disorders, we use buprenorphine or we use methadone. Kratom may be similar to this. Now, we haven't conducted any clinical trials because that faces hurdles by the regulatory agencies, particularly FDA. So we cannot tell how effective it would be compared to buprenorphine or methadone, but there seems to be some indication that it helps a certain group of people, at least, to overcome some of the withdrawal symptoms and to help them actually to get off of some of the opioids that they have been previously using. And not only opioids, but also some other stimulant drugs such as methamphetamine, for example.
You talk a lot about kratom being acting on the opioid receptors, but it appears as though from this study that kratom also acts on other brain receptors that involves dopamine, serotonin. What did you find in that study that shows that kratom could also be used as an alternative to maybe antidepressants or antipsychotics?
Yeah, so whenever we conduct surveys, it's hard to kind of distinguish exactly what the mechanism of action is, right? So we basically just ask folks, hey, what benefits did you see with the use? And in this particular survey, we also asked what potential detriments or what potential adverse effects did you observe or did you experience with the use of kratom? So we cannot necessarily narrow it down to what particular receptors or what particular neurotransmitters were involved. But we can link kind of the effects, both the beneficial and some of the adverse effects, to either associate them with animal studies that have been conducted, both with kratom and with the isolated agents, mitragynine, 7-hydroxymitragynine, or we can, by extension, say if kratom, even if taken in higher amounts and higher doses, does not lead to a particular set of adverse effects or beneficial effects, as do classical opioids being heroin, being oxycodone, being hydrocodone, being morphine, that there is something that is different in kratom that distinguishes it from the classical opioids in its mechanism of action, but we cannot narrow it down in particular to a particular receptor system or neurotransmitter.
And is that just because there haven't been clinical studies, or do the animal studies show us anything about how that works?
Yeah, so there have been animal studies conducted,
Mm-hmm.
and as you indicated in your journal club review of that review that we published on the potential use of kratom and its active ingredients, the proposed active ingredients, mitragynine, 7-hydroxymitragynine. There is more to it than just its opioid effects. And more to it means that some animal studies have investigated not only its effects on opioid receptors, but also its effects on other systems, on other neurotransmitters. You already mentioned dopamine. There is some activity at adrenergic receptors that have been studied for mitragynine itself. So one aspect is, I think that at the moment, much focus is being placed on mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine as the active ingredients in kratom. But kratom overall, when we look at the whole leaf, the powdered leaf, which is primarily what is being consumed, there are hundreds of different compounds in it, not only the alkaloids, which mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine belong to, but also a range of other compounds that are not alkaloids. And I think we know from the literature that some of these other non-alkaloid compounds may contribute to the range, to the full spectrum of effects that kratom may exert. And we haven't yet explored any of these compounds and their potential contribution to the effects that kratom shows on the user.
Have you found much recreational use of kratom anywhere? I know maybe I think in Southeast Asia, there's a certain cocktail that's used recreationally by young people there. But as far as I can tell with comments on our site, and it seems like everybody's either using it for pain, for, cessation of other drugs, withdrawal, some kind of mental health issue. Have you seen in your surveys a lot of use that would be considered recreational, whatever that means?
So kratom by itself, when we look at the leaf, the powdered leaf, and I intentionally don't want to use the word extract, because extract implies that you use basically a solvent to extract certain compounds, to enrich basically certain compounds, certain substances from the leaf and get rid of certain other compounds. That's what an extract means. And that is often done for herbal supplements. Often we have extracts to enrich certain compounds because they are considered the active principles. We see that for St. John's wort, for example. We see that for other passion flower or whatever we call them extracts, because we often use something like alcohol or something alike to enrich these compounds, which we don't see for kratom at the moment. We have specialized extracts sometimes that are being sold either in liquid or in kind of a powdered form. But primarily what we see still being used is just basically the ground up leaf. It's dried and it's ground up into a powder, and people are ingesting it in various doses. So what we do not see is that somebody tries to inject the powder, that somebody tries to really smoke the leaf. Sometimes you can buy just loose leaf material that is kind of almost like a tea, like to make a tea out of it. We don't see that. So that indicates from a perspective of somebody who is concerned about addiction, that there is not a drive to really increase the delivery and get it into the central nervous system or into the bloodstream much faster, because basically bypassing the oral route of administration. When we talk about ingesting it, it goes through the stomach, it has to go through the intestine, it has to be, from there, it has to first go through the liver before it actually goes into the bloodstream. And that has shown to be a very inefficient way to deliver mitragynine, for example. So there isn't much that gets into the bloodstream that way. About 3% of the mitragynine that is present in the powder actually gets into the bloodstream. So if folks were really interested in using it for recreational purposes to get high, they would try to find ways to circumvent the liver, circumvent the oral route, basically smoke it, try to find other ways to get the mitragynine into the central nervous system, and we don't see that happening.
Then that gets me into the toxicity of kratom. There was a report done by Eggleston. It was called Kratom Use and Toxicities in the United States and Pharmacotherapy. He reported that he used kratom exposures reported to the National Poison Data System and also county medical examiners' office records. You wrote, along with a few others, you wrote a critique of that. And what do you think? Why do you think this report needed a critique, measuring toxicities from poison control and medical examiners? And you also have a background in forensics, so I was interested particularly in your opinion about this.
So what has evolved over recent years is we are tracking kind of what the FDA and other agencies is tracking is basically the severe and also the deaths, the severe effects or severe requiring hospital admissions, and also the deaths associated with kratom exposures. Now, I've had ongoing discussions with folks that are conducting research, are involved in the sphere of conducting research on kratom. And when you look closer into these cases that are labeled as being associated with kratom, what often emerges, or what emerges as a theme, is that these are not kratom only exposures. Mm-hmm. So they are polydrug exposures, so meaning that more than just kratom is involved. It might be alcohol, it might be benzodiazepines, it might be another opioid is involved. And I think we can all agree that kratom is not innocuous. It's not to be taken like chocolate. Mm-hmm. It's not like gummy bears. It is definitely something that has pharmacological effects. Yeah. And it should be treated as such. So somebody who takes kratom should take it responsibly for themselves, and especially if they are caretakers for others. So there is a certain manageable risk associated with taking kratom, especially if somebody has an underlying health disorder and is taking another medication for it. So in that regard, I I do advocate that somebody who wants to take Kratom for the self-treatment of a pre-existing health condition and is already on medication should consult with a healthcare provider, should consult with their physician or with their pharmacist or with a nurse practitioner, because there is a potential for drug interactions. The problem that we're facing at the moment is that we do not know a lot about Kratom, and many healthcare providers are not well educated about Kratom. And some treat it just as a supplement and might just discourage any and all use of it. And to many Kratom users, that is just basically a sign that they do not want to disclose its use, understandably so, because there's basically a disinterest of engaging with the user, with the patient in this case. And if that is not addressed in a reasonable manner, then I understand that patients, that Kratom users do not want to disclose that use. There's a stigma associated with it as well. You might be seen as a drug user, basically, because you're using Kratom, which I think is also a very wrong approach. And it is being in part perpetuated by the FDA, by regulatory agencies, which doesn't help either, because people who are using Kratom at the moment for self-treatment of pain are afraid to lose access to Kratom, because then they might have only the other option of taking opioids. And either they have developed a dependence on opioids before and have managed to get rid of that dependence, or they are afraid to develop a dependence in the first place. So I do understand that people are hesitant to disclose their use of Kratom, but it is important to at least consult with a healthcare provider. And if you have a healthcare provider that is not open to discussing the use, then I would go to another healthcare provider, and until you find somebody that is open to discuss it with you in a meaningful and welcoming manner, because there is a way to integrate Kratom into therapy. When it comes to the Eggleston paper, my discussions that have looked at different cases of Kratom, like I said, polydrug use, so attributing causation to the role of Kratom in either the adverse effects, the severity of the adverse effects, or saying that Kratom was causatively linked in the death of a person if other compounds were present, cannot be established at this point. Because once you have a benzodiazepine, another opioid present, then we simply cannot reach the conclusion that Kratom was the one compound that was causative in the fatality, because of the presence of other compounds that could just as likely have contributed to the fatality.
I mean, we and you know, it just seems like all the deaths involve polydrug use that are considered Kratom alone deaths. Do we even know, the lethal dose of mitragynine in humans, or is there something else that could possibly be taken that contributes to like a Kratom alone toxicity?
So that's the problem. So I have to admit that for many compounds, for many substances, we do not have a human lethal dose, because obviously it's unethical to conduct any trials that would establish a lethal dose.
Yeah.
What we have sometimes from from extended reports over years, sometimes over decades, is that we can say with a certain degree of certainty, basically, that if you reach a certain dose, you are quite likely that you will die from that particular dose or from that particular blood concentration. Now, the trouble with Kratom, and that was actually the title of a publication earlier this year by Papsun et al., is that the range of reported concentrations of mitragynine in blood samples, both involving people who were intoxicated, so where, for example, a driving under the influence was determined, where mitragynine was found, and also post-mortem, so fatalities where mitragynine was determined, was all over the place. So in some cases, it was as low as 50 nanograms per milliliter mitragynine, and in other cases, it was as high as over 10,000 nanograms per milliliter. So we certainly cannot establish a what we call an LD50 lethal dose, where 50% of a population that is exposed to the drug is basically dying from the exposure from that particular dose. We cannot establish that in humans.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, we do not have an LD50 for mitragynine in animals yet, at least not in rodents, which are commonly used to establish an LD50, at least not for acute exposure to mitragynine.
Yeah, and it seems as though, because I was looking at some of those where they tried to establish an LD50, and the one was, estimated to be about 550 milligrams per kilogram, and I kind of tried to convert that into what would the human equivalent dose be, and that would be in an average batch of kratom, that would be like eating a whole kilo in one sitting. So it doesn't seem like we have really good information there. But how do these coroners, when they label a death a kratom caused death, what mistakes are they making there? Is it just because they don't have any other answers and they don't know what this kratom is?
That's a good question. I cannot speak for a coroner or for a medical examiner or who conducts the autopsy in every single instance. I think sometimes it's an exclusion diagnosis, basically, that because they cannot find anything else in a drug screen or that everything else seems to be fairly normal, and they cannot find any other indications that could have caused the death other than the mitragynine, they then conclude that it has to be the mitragynine or the kratom. And I wouldn't necessarily say that that is unusual because of the way that kratom is currently being viewed, because there are compounds in kratom that can and interact with opioid receptors, that it may impair your ability to operate a vehicle. So, for example, if death occurs while operating a vehicle, if it's a fatal accident, for example, then there is there could be a reasonable assumption that somebody lost control over the vehicle, and that basically kratom was involved in that, right? So it's a complicated issue, and sometimes we left with an exclusion diagnosis, basically, and all that there is mitragynine in the blood.
I believe it's maybe the same report that your student worked on. It was a man in Pennsylvania, a young man who died in a car accident. His parents ended up suing a kratom company, and the coroner was actually, there was a journalist, Nick Wing, who tried to get the toxicology reports from the medical examiner, and it was listed as acute mitragynine toxicity as the cause of his death. But, he actually died in a car accident. I'm not sure if you have any opinion about that, but the coroner actually fought to keep those reports hidden, and it just seems like there's something suspicious going on there. But I don't know what there might be something with medical examiners where they don't want to release information, but it seemed as though there was that kind of gets to the question of, you said the FDA is presenting hurdles to research. Are those hurdles mainly political, or is it a result of maybe other research that they're promoting that kind of shows maybe the worst parts of kratom, or maybe some negative reports that the FDA wants to promote?
Well, the intentions of a regulatory agency sometimes remain a little bit opaque, I would say. The FDA has been they have been very vocal about their opposition to kratom for years now. And they haven't really let up. At least they haven't reversed their course, even with the transition to a new commissioner. When Dr. Gottlieb stepped down, or when a new commissioner was appointed. But the DEA has not followed through with the 8-factor analysis recommendation or the conclusions that the FDA reached based on their 8-factor analysis, which is still not completely publicly known what the actual 8-factor analysis is. Not all pages are publicly available. When it comes to regulatory agencies in general, I think their mission to protect public health is on the forefront. And I can understand in part that when they hear the word opioid receptor and act on or interact with the opioid receptor, that some red lights go on for them. And especially if it's then potentially touted as a dietary supplement, that they see another potential source of an opioid emerging amidst an opioid pandemic. And not using the word opioid pandemic lightly here, but we really have a severe opioid substance use disorder problem in the United States, and it's ravaging through communities. Has been done so for years, and the reaction on state and the federal level has been a little bit sluggish, to say the least. So the FDA may have overreacted, and they stay their course because they cannot necessarily try to provide a middle ground for kratom in terms of scheduling action. It's a dietary supplement or herbal supplement. So the only thing that they can really do is to basically say, we recommend placing it in Schedule 1 for now. What has been done by states taking their own actions is basically to say, we want products on the market that consumers can rely on in terms of quality. We want them labeled accurately so that consumers know what they get when they buy it. And they need to be basically a limitation on how much mitragynine and thereby also 7-hydroxymitragynine is contained in these products, and that they're not adulterated. And I think that is essential. I would potentially go a step further and say that you need to talk to a healthcare provider before you can access these products, because it is important that you are aware of the potential drug interactions that are associated with the use of Kratom. Mm-hmm. That would be my thing that I would potentially add to it. But I can understand the FDA being concerned about it. But when you look at the science, what the science has been reporting and all the facts that have been emerging over the years, it is clear that Kratom, mitragynine, 7-hydroxymitragynine so far are not the same. You cannot categorize mitragynine as being the exact same as a classical opioid receptor full agonist like fentanyl, like heroin, like morphine. And I think that is something that the FDA continues to ignore in their considerations.
Why would it be difficult for scientists to study a controlled substance?
So I like to compare it, as I'm sure others have done before me, to the whole issue with marijuana research.
Yeah.
We still face significant hurdles in obtaining marijuana, or if we look at many of the other psychoactive substances, if we talk about psilocybin, if we talk about MDMA, LSD, for research purposes, the hoops and hurdles one has to step over, jump through in order to get these products for preclinical, so animal studies, in vitro studies on cells, and then even higher, so obviously if you want to actually study them in humans, is significant. For marijuana, because that's the closest comparison when we talk about a natural product, when we talk about a plant that you need to have, we only have one facility in the United States that is federally approved to grow marijuana, and that's at the University of Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And the marijuana that is grown there is not close to the quality of commercial marijuana products that are available in Colorado, Washington, or other states that allow medical or recreational marijuana. So what we currently study in the limited clinical trials on marijuana is not up to date of what is available on the market. So what people can actually purchase and use in therapy at the moment. So we have a disconnect. And if we now schedule Kratom through scheduling mitragynine, 7-hydroxymitragynine, would basically set us back to the beginnings of marijuana. It would take us years to get even to the point where marijuana is at the moment. I don't know if states could maintain their independence in where they at right now with their scheduling activities. I don't know if the federal scheduling activity would initially, I have to admit, I'm not that savvy when it comes to the federal scheduling, if that would initially overrule and then would put everything back. I don't know. So you have to jump through all of these hurdles to even get to it. And it would just be a huge, and obviously we wouldn't have access to the Kratom users that are currently using. We wouldn't be able to actually study how people are using it now, what the behavior is, who's using it. So it would, the access for Kratom users would be, that's the other thing, obviously, that Kratom users would not have access to it any longer. And we're talking about millions of Kratom users in the United States.
And you recently did a study on toxic metals and salmonella present in Kratom, and if it was an underground sold on the illegal market, you wouldn't even be able to measure these things. As it is now, you found a lot of levels of toxic metals in kratom available in the western suburbs of Chicago. We've had kratom contaminated with salmonella, and then we've also had like food. So how does kratom become infected with salmonella?
So, regarding the kind of supply chain of products, because kratom is currently not regulated, there's really no incentive for no direct. Well, I'm not saying no incentive, because you could lose your kratom users if you put out a product that is contaminated. And but initially, there's obviously a risk to those who are purchasing it and then get sick from it. You have that upfront risk, basically, and the FDA regulates food and regulates supplements that are recognized as such to adhere to certain microbial contamination standards. And that goes throughout the supply chain. So it starts at the source, and then you go through the different steps where you have microbial monitoring up to the end product. That doesn't happen currently with kratom. So often it is, if the leaves are not dried properly, if mold can grow on them, if they're in an environment where mold is allowed to grow. So if the leaves are kept and they can't grow, they can't dry fully. And then you kind of get mold growth, you get kind of bacterial growth, and that's how the spores are then introduced, basically. And that's when you have contamination with potentially salmonella as well. And that can be introduced at various stages. Usually it happens at the drying stage, so relatively early on. And there's just no way of telling that unless you actually test the product for microbial contamination.
Yeah, and I've also heard that it's dried outdoors, and then like certain animals could walk over it and leave droppings, and that can be contaminated that way. And the other was the presence of toxic metals, which you actually found in those samples. You think it might be from the old machines used in grinding the kratom into powder, but also it mentions that there are metals present in the soil from volcanic soil there in Indonesia. If the metals are coming naturally from the soil, is there really any way to ensure the safety of kratom from Indonesia?
In our discussion, we were a little bit speculating about where the contamination came from.
Yeah.
Because we don't have soil samples to match it.
Okay.
So to be honest, we don't know to what degree that comes from mining runoff, for example, because kratom trees are known to grow close to freshwater, to little streams or anything like that. So it could be runoff from mining. It could be indeed from volcanic, so directly in the soil from volcanic soil, or it could be from the grinding process. So we were speculating there, to be honest. So we would have to actually go and get soil samples to see if this is from the soil, if it's introduced through the grinding process, from the manufacturing process, from processing the leaves, or where it is introduced, to then conclude if there are measures that can be taken to avoid heavy metal introduction during the processing, or if it is indeed directly in the leaves and we need to find other ways to get rid of the heavy metals.
Okay, and there was another concern about I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right. It was Acinetobacter in the loose leaf material. What is that, and is it dangerous?
So naturally, if you have leaf material, if you have any plant material, you will always find some degree of bacteria and fungi or stuff like that on it. It's just because it's plant, it's just natural. When we eat our food, you will not get rid of all of the bacteria that naturally are just present. If you take a carrot out of the earth, out of the ground, you wash it, but that doesn't get rid of all of the bacteria that are naturally in the ground, in the soil. So some contamination with bacteria is always expected. It will always be present. When these bacteria reach a certain level, there is a small risk that, for example, an imbalance in the gastrointestinal bacteria may occur. So the risk with Acinetobacter is that you might get diarrhea potentially for a little while. So that's for an otherwise healthy person.
Yeah.
The risk is a little bit higher for people that have are immunocompromised. So, for example, somebody who has Crohn's disease or something that has an immunocompromised intestinal barrier, for example, that tend to have inflammation in gastrointestinal or intestinal inflammation that can then lead to a stronger immune response. So that's when we get into specific populations that might be more vulnerable to have a stronger immune response and might have a flare-up of their intestinal condition. And those people are in general more prone to developing inflammation or have a reaction to most ingested food items that cannot be cooked. So what I would recommend, if you take Kratom, then brew a tea with hot water, because that will eliminate quite a few of these bacteria. So instead of making it with orange juice, for example, where you don't necessarily cook the powder, where it's not heated to higher temperatures, make it with hot water first.
Yeah, I was actually had that question written down to ask. I'm trying to get people to drink tea instead of just swallowing it, because it just tastes better like that anyway. But would testing and labeling requirements by companies take care of most of these toxicities, or would the test be sort of cost prohibitive and make the Kratom costs far more than what the risks involve?
So it would certainly make the products on average more expensive. That is something that I think is something that we need to consider in the interest of safety. How much is safety worth to us as the consumer? And I would argue that it is definitely worth paying more, but I'm not a Kratom consumer. I have actually never consumed it, so I cannot speak to it. And I also realize that compared to some other products, that Kratom is actually fairly expensive as it is already. I hope, though, that the market can find a good balance once it has kind of adjusted to some of these changes, because I think it is important to provide consumers with a product they can trust, that it has the quality, and that eventually the FDA can implement this basically, that Kratom products can be marketed with the same FDA requirements, which include quality and labeling, as is now basically being implemented by certain states. So it's not that the FDA cannot implement oversight on kratom products as dietary supplements if they would allow it to be grandfathered in under the DSHEA, under the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994.
You worked on a paper called Public Perceptions Toward Kratom Use in Malaysia. How do public perceptions of kratom consumers differ in like Southeast Asia in general and the West? And does this public perception lead to bad or good drug policy in general?
That's a great question. So kratom is used so kratom has been traditionally used quite frequently and is still quite frequently used in Malaysia, in Southeast Asia, by folks that just basically have a kratom tree in their backyard and they pick the leaves off and use it either to just chew on a leaf and kind of stay awake, or to increase their stamina when they are day laborers, or they buy kratom tea in little bags from a local vendor to self-treat pain, or primarily pain after a hard day's work. So it is used by more of a rural inhabitants, not necessarily in large cities, I would say. But it is seen as a traditional drug that is tolerated there. And it is not seen as a bad habit. Certainly nothing like an opioid or like amphetamine, which is a large problem in Malaysia as well, and in Thailand. So it's definitely distinct from that because it has such a long use history. The reason that it was banned, but is still kind of tolerated, is because it has, to my knowledge, kind of interfered with the opium business that has grown in Malaysia in the 1960s and 1970s. So that kind of led to its ban, but even that is now being reconsidered. So there have been some, at least for medical uses, kratom may be made available again, or maybe used by folks in Malaysia again, and in Thailand as well. In the West, I think what was really surprising to me is to see the average kratom user, when we look at the demographics, is not like an opioid or illicit opioid user, like a heroin user, or like an illicit drug user in general, in terms of their age range. They tend to be middle-aged, they tend to be employed, they tend to be married, they tend to be they tend to have a middle-class income, they tend to have health insurance. These are not necessarily, this is not the profile of an illicit drug user that we usually see. So it's definitely a distinction for kratom users in the United States. And it's primarily still used in the self-treatment of acute and chronic pain and mental and emotional conditions. So its use is not primarily focused on as not even focused on mitigation strategy. It is used for that purpose. I'm not saying it's not, but it's not the primary use. More people are using it for acute and chronic pain and for an emotional or a mental condition such as depression, anxiety, as I mentioned. So I see it used in a very different manner from a recreational drug in the West.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems as though like when you Google Kratom for the first time, it's in the news. It's sort of categorized as like bath salts or spice or whatever some of these new chemical drugs were a few years ago. Do you think that perception you can get around that, since it doesn't seem to reflect the reality of why people are using Kratom?
So I think when we look at spice, at synthetic cannabinoids, or we look at the pyrovalerones, the bath salts, I have yet to find somebody who is using those for a medical condition. I have not found anybody who is telling me. Now, granted, I haven't necessarily looked for them, but I haven't heard anybody use those to treat a really medical condition. So no, I don't think that you can. It is really like apples and oranges, or not even fruit. It's more like a salad and a candy bar. If you want to treat Kratom as a salad and the other one as a candy bar. No, I think what we see in media, at least in like kind of the clickbait media, is they want to jump on a headline and draw folks in because it is sensationalized. And we see that in all parts of our daily life. When it's a headline and it's sensational, it draws you in. But once you actually question it, when you think critically about it, and you do some research on your own and actually look in the scientific literature, you see the distinction. And I know that sometimes policy is influenced by public perception, but what I found astonishing about public perception when it comes to Kratom is that I don't think that the public is necessarily all that that it's not really a one-sided issue for Kratom in the public. I think that people realize that Kratom is not like a bath salt, and it's not like the spice, or it's not like K2 spice, or whatever you want to call it. I think people realize that. And I've had like community engagements where I'm located, where I talk to folks in the community who wanted to know more about it. I had engagements with healthcare professionals who wanted to know more about it. And either they didn't know before about Kratom, or they had heard about it, but they didn't really have an opinion yet. But once we got into the topic, and we had like a Q&A going back and forth, it became very obvious that they understood relatively quickly what the applications and what its uses were. And I like I said here, I'm not treating it as an innocuous, completely free of any adverse effects substance, or it's not. So I tell people what I think about it very openly, and then let them make their own decisions. Well, thank you first, Brian, and,
Yeah.
and to all of you listeners. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I hope that that Kratom remains available as a safe, as we had discussed, as a safe and high quality product. And I really encourage everybody who is currently using Kratom to seek out vendors that actually label their products accordingly. That's really something that I would encourage everybody to do, and ask their vendors to actually label them, to put a little bit of pressure on them to do that. There are a few studies that might be coming out, or that are currently in the works. Most of them are obviously preclinical. We don't have any human studies at the moment. But there is a lot of movement when it comes to clinical studies. So we are trying as a community, and that's the good thing about the Kratom research community. We're not competing with one another. We really are working together, and there's a lot of collaboration going on in trying to find out the pharmacology and the toxicology of Kratom to serve consumers and move things forward on the regulatory front as well.
That was awesome. I'm so grateful for Dr. Oliver Grundmann for getting to have that conversation. I hope you enjoyed it too. The music is Risey. The song is Memories of Thailand. The Kratom Science podcast is written and produced by me, Brian Gallagher, for KratomScience.com. Take care.